खोल दे बड़ा कर दो इसके पीछे ओपनिंग का उधर से देते हैं पीछे नीचे से इशारा कर दो
Friends, a very good morning to all. We welcome you on behalf of ACAE at this program daily session of 11. Today we have with us our speaker, C.A. Sumit Binani. He is also our executive committee member and the chairman of Insolvency and Bankruptcy Court Committee. So our session would today be on the the discussion on the disciplinary orders which has been given by the IBBI on the insolvency professional. Friends, as we all know that there has been an advisory by the Ministry of Home Affairs regarding the using of Zoom map. Friends, let me tell you, we are trying to use the security features, whatever is possible and whatever is there in the Zoom, so that your access or other participation is safe. So please follow the advisories that you enter a meeting by giving your name, and it would be better if you rather sign in and enter the session enter the session. And even if you have any problem with the security, you can definitely join us live on Facebook. We are regularly live on Facebook. Every session is live on Facebook, and our videos are also available in the YouTube in the same day in the evening. So, friends, with this, I think all of the participants over here pretty well know Sumit Binani ji. He is a reputed insolvency professional and one of the few insolvency professionals who have done the last 12 cases, who was the resolution professional in last 12 cases. So, friends, I would straightforward hand over the session proceedings to Sumit Binani ji. So, Sumit ji, over to you. You may start the session.
Thank you very much to the Association of Corporate Advisors and Executives for organizing this particular session where we will be dealing with all the orders of IBBI till date. And those orders have been necessarily passed against the contravention of the insolvency professionals. And let me tell you, friends, that many of the insolvency professionals who are present over here and consultants practicing in this area must have at some point of time felt that we are being over-regulated as far as this relative law is concerned as compared to the other laws and areas in which we are practicing. But then after going through the orders, I've been compiling the orders for the sake of this presentation. I felt that the motive of the insolvency, the regulator, is to basically create a world-class institution. And the idea is to empower the insolvency professionals so that they conduct themselves in a manner of the entire world. The regulator also expects that the confidence in the insolvency regime as far as our country is concerned only come in when the conduct of the insolvency professional is par excellence. And the regulator also feels that the world is watching, and that is why the law empowers the IPs to discharge their responsibility effectively. The code also has several provisions to ensure its integrity, objectivity, independence, and impartiality. And it also requires the insolvency professional to be a fit and proper person. It is essential that the insolvency representative is appropriately qualified and also possesses the knowledge, experience, and also friends' personal qualities that will ensure not only the effective and efficient conduct of the proceedings, but also it will go on a long way to provide confidence to the insolvency regime. So this objective, you will see that whenever the disciplinary committee has dealt with several matters, there have been around 20 to 24 matters till date in the past 3 years as far as disciplinary proceedings of IP is concerned. You'll find that the disciplinary committee has been cognizant of the fact that this law is new. They have evaluated in each of the cases and wherever they have found that there have been some malified conduct, they have been very, very harsh. But wherever there have been a bona fide conduct, the DC has been lenient. But at the same time, let me tell you, friends, that a contravention, DC feels that a contravention is always a contravention. If it could not have been avoided by the insolvency professional, fine. They have not treated it as in. They have treated it as in contravention, but they have not imposed penalty. But then wherever there has been the intent of malified or ignorance or negligence, then the DCs have imposed fine in the form of pecuniary penalty. In some of the cases, the IPs have been barred from acting as insolvency professional for a temporary period of time. In one or two cases where the uh, intent was not at all up to the mark of the code, then the insolvency professionals have been barred for a period of 10 years. And in one case, the insolvency professional has been barred for lifetime. In most of the cases where monetary penalty has been levied, we have found that the disciplinary committee has also asked the insolvency professional to go through the examination once again, so that he's aware of the nuances of the code, so that in future there is no such negligency on his part as far as his role is concerned. So friends, what I've done is that I have prepared a brief note, a backgrounder, which basically summarizes the entire presentation. I will deal with those contraventions, and this backgrounder will also be circulated to you, so that it is kept with you for your future reference. And for that purpose, I'm sharing the same on the screen. So the president, are you able to see it is shared? Is everybody able to see?
Yeah. Please.
Yeah. So I hope the font size and all is clear to all the participants. And so friends, let us, while I was mentioning that what is the expectation of the regulator, it is very important for us to understand that what the BLRC in its final report emphasized on the role of the IP. It said, and I'm reading, the insolvency professionals form a crucial pillar upon which rests the effective, timely functioning as well as credibility of the entire edifice of the insolvency and bankruptcy resolution process. In administering the resolution outcomes, the role of IP encompasses a wide range of functions, which include adhering to the procedure of the law, as well as the accounting and finance related functions. The latter include the identification of the assets and liabilities of the defaulting debtor, its management during the insolvency proceedings, if it is an enterprise, preparation of resolution proposal, implementation of the solution for individual resolution, construction, negotiation, mediation of deals, as well as distribution of the realization under the bankruptcy resolution. In performing these tasks, an IP acts as an agent of the adjudicator. In the BLRC report itself, it was mentioned that the insolvency professional would be acting as the agent of the adjudicating authority. Later on, we found that in several of the judgments, the adjudicating authority also mentioned this point. So in a way, the adjudicator depends upon the specialized skills and expertise of the insolvency professionals to carry out these tasks in an efficient and professional manner. This creates the role of resolution professional in CRP, the positive externality of better utilization of judicial time. So this gives you a sense that is what is expected out of the resolution professional. It further stated that IP makes sure that assets are not stolen. These IPs will be delegated the task of monitoring and managing matters of business by the adjudicators, so that both creditors and debtor can take comfort that economic value is not eroded by actions taken by the other. So friends, what it essentially says is that in fact the adjudicator, that is the National Company Law Tribunal and Appellate Tribunal and also the Supreme Court, they are basically delegating their role to the IPs, so that they can conduct the insolvency resolution process in a manner so that it provides comfort that economic value is not eroded by actions taken by the other who are invested in those corporate debtor. So we can very well imagine the kind of trust and the confidence which the regime has reposed, and therefore it expects us to basically stand out and at par excellence as far as our conduct is concerned. You'll also note that UNCITRAL legislative guide on insolvency law also says that insolvency representative plays a central role in the efficient and effective implementation of the insolvency law with certain powers over debtors. Accordingly, it is essential that the insolvency representative be appropriately qualified, possesses the knowledge, experience, and personal qualities that will ensure not only the effective and efficient conduct of the proceedings, but also there is confidence in the insolvency regime. So again, it is harping on the word confidence in the insolvency regime. If you see the International Monetary Fund, they have described the role of a liquidator and the administrator in effective implementation of the law as follows. As court-appointed officials, have an obligation to ensure that the law is applied effectively and impartially. Moreover, since they normally must have most information regarding the circumstances of the debtor, they are the best in the position to make informed decisions. So the law empowers the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India and the Insolvency Professional Agency to basically formulate a two-tier structure to regulate the insolvency professional. And in the words of Dr. M.S. Sahu, who is the chairperson of IBBI, the insolvency professional, mark it very closely. The insolvency professional is in its infancy. It is in a stage in which reputation is formed. Once the society forms a perception about a profession, it is very difficult to change. It is therefore incumbent upon the insolvency professionals to build and safeguard the reputation of the profession, which should enjoy the trust of the society and inspire confidence on all the stakeholders. They must justify the exalted status of an institution bestowed on them under the code. So friends, this particular quote basically gives you the background, and it would basically satisfy our queries as to why the regulator has been so harsh right from day one as far as the conduct of the insolvency professional is concerned, because the objective of the code is very, very clear. Right since the inception of insolvency professional, our regulator wants us to showcase ourselves as a profession with par excellence, as a profession which would provide confidence in the regime, at a profession where nobody would act as a finger, because it is one of the crucial pillars in the code. Even the adjudicating authority rely on our judgment when we are on the task and report to the adjudicating authority. So that is why it is very, very important. I will not be talking about the penalties imposed in the cases which I've been dealing. I am not taking the name of insolvency professionals who are all my brothers. But then when I will take you through the cases, you will also find that there are certain errors and omissions which all of us might have made, and we should learn and take a cue from these basically case laws, so that we can go forward and conduct ourselves in a manner which is, in letter and spirit of the code of conduct which is prescribed in the insolvency professional regulations. And let me tell you, friends, before reading anything else, first, in this basically a time of close down or lockdown, an insolvency professional, I would personally request him to go through the code of conduct, because most of the case laws you will find over here has been aligned to the contravention of the code of conduct by the insolvency professional. So it is very, very important that we go through all the 25 or 28 clauses of the code of conduct which is prescribed for us in the insolvency professional regulations. As far as penalties are concerned, in almost 24, 25 cases, you will find in some of the cases there have been warning, in some of the cases there have been fine levied, in some of the cases there have been suspension, whether temporary or permanent, and the DC, while making the judgment, has been conscious of the fact that the insolvency professional is a relatively very new law. It is still developing, though it has been very, very lenient also as far as various order is concerned, and wherever there were malified intent, it has been really very, very harsh. So if you can see on your screen, what I have done is that this document, as I told you, will be provided to you. It is hyperlinked, and there are 19 cases which I have tabled, and each of the cases have been hyperlinked to the document. So first case would be the non-acceptance. Sorry, just a moment. Hello, yeah. Contravention, basically to non-acceptance of claim by RP and failure to respond to claimant. So here in this matter, what has happened is that the Operational creditor has filed its claim in one of the cases, but the insolvency professional probably missed the claim, and he also did not respond to the operational creditor. Seeing no response coming from the insolvency professional, the operational creditor once again filed its claim, but again there was no response. And immediately after the fag end of the expected end of the CRP process, the resolution professional filed the operational creditor basically getting no clue from the insolvency professional filed a petition before the adjudicating authority. And prior to that, the operational creditor has also written to the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India that on umpteen occasion they have been writing to the insolvency professional, but the insolvency professional has not responded, neither accepted their claim. So in turn also earlier board wrote 3 letters to insolvency professional asking for the details as to why the claim has not been admitted, but the insolvency professional did not even respond to the board. And finally, as I mentioned, when an application was filed before the adjudicating authority by the operational creditor, that was immediately after the end of the CRP process. The RP responded to the board that no, there is an application filed before the adjudicating authority, and once the directions is received from the adjudicating authority, he will act accordingly. Thereafter, he wrote back to the board that the adjudicating authority has asked him to give a personal hearing to the operational creditor, and after giving the personal hearing to the operational creditor, he has admitted his claim. So this was the brief facts of the matter, and you will find that the IBBI very clearly stated that this has been the violation of clause 13 of the Code of Conduct of the Insolvency Professional. Friends, let me tell you over here that as insolvency professional, let us make it a regime that whenever we are handling claim, let us attend to all the mails which we receive from the claimants, whether it is financial creditors, operational creditors, workmen, employee. I mean, when I act as an insolvency professional, I make sure that I hire a intern or I hire a person who is only dedicated to handle my emails. Whatever email you receive, it is my suggestion that we must respond to that immediately, maybe within 1 or 2 days. What I personally do is that as a best practice, whenever I receive a mail, at least I respond back telling them that, okay, I have received your mail and I'll come back. That is very, very important, because if we are able to conduct ourselves in a fashion, chances are that we will not omit out of any inadvertence any communication from the operational creditor. And in fact, when it is so important as filing a claim, it is very, very important that the clause 13 of Code of Conduct really mandates him to adhere to the timelines and also respond to all the claimant, because if you fail to respond to the claimant, there is a violation. So the board felt that IRP did not consider the claim of the complainant. He did not even respond to him. He was subsequently appointed as RP. As RP, he also neither considered the claim nor responded to the complainant. He utterly disregarded his statutory duty under Section 18(1)(b) of the Code, which mandates him to receive and collate all claims. So he contravened the provisions of Section 18(1), read with clause 13, and the board also felt that he also disregarded repeated requests of the board for a response on the complaint. He responded to the board only after a show cause notice was issued to him. He made the stakeholder as well as the board helpless. It is unbecoming of a professional to ignore repeated requests of the claimant and the board for the entire CIP period. Therefore, he failed to comply the provisions of Section 196, 1G and H of the Code, which empowers the board to monitor the performance of an IP and call for information and records from an IP. He also failed to comply with clause 1 and 19 of the Code of Conduct, which require an IP to be honest, straightforward, and forthright, and to provide all information and records as may be provided to the board. Failure to consider a claim deprives the claimant of his rights. It also deprives the potential resolution applicants to have complete information required to submit a complete resolution plan. While implementing the resolution plan, if the resolution applicant discovers a liability to the claimant which has not been factored into the plan, the resolution plan will be frustrated. Hence, the failure of the part of the RP is a serious dereliction of the duty cast on an IP under section so and so of the code. So friends, we saw that it is very, very important, and the stance taken by the disciplinary committee What I have done is that in my document, I have just included certain pointers from the order which I thought that it was relevant. Of course, the order number and date is there provided in the document. If one wants to read this order, they can definitely download it from the website of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. Second is IP resigned before completion of CIR. So friends, here is a case when RP was handling multiple, in fact, he was handling 4 different assignments. And in all the assignments, he resigned before the completion of CIRP, citing different reasons. Those reasons were either personal, preoccupation, or health reasons. And in one of the cases, he mentioned that because the COC was not paying the bills of the service providers, so I'm not willing to continue as the CRP, in the CRP as a resolution professional. Now, look at what the order of the DC says. The only hope of a sinking ship is its captain. He cannot run away leaving the sinking ship in the mid-sea. The code provides for an insolvency professional to run the corporate debtor at the time of distress. He cannot run away from the CD when it needs the IP the most. The IP ran away from multiple engagements, jeopardizing the life of all such corporate debtors and the interest of all the stakeholders. So you would also see that IP also provided different reasons for leaving the assignments, and and before different fora also. So in this case, what happens when the RP was asked that why is he leaving the assignment? So to the COC, he submitted that because the COC was not paying. No, to the COC he submitted that it is out of personal and health issues. And when the matter was heard and argued before the adjudicating authority, before NCLAT, he mentioned that the reason was non-payment of bills of service providers, which the COC was not approving. In one of the other matter, he said, before the NCLAT, he also said that he is resigning because of preoccupation. So he conveniently changed his stance to suit his requirements, and thus he was held violative and contravening various provisions of the code, including the code of conduct. So friends, it is very, very clear from this judgment that unless and until there are extremely pressing reasons, we should not leave the assignment. And that is what the code of conduct and the insolvency and bankruptcy law provides. And that is what the board expects as a regulator from us. IP appointed valuer based on recommendation by one financial creditor. Hence, very, very important. When the insolvency regime began in 2016, in most of the cases, we saw that whenever we were appointing certain professionals, we had this advice from so many advisors that the appointment is also to be approved by the financial creditor. Whereas the real reason for going before the financial creditor was to get the approval on the payment of the fees out of that appointment, because that has to be part of that has to form part of the CRP cost, and hence we would not be able to make any payment to the professionals whom we appoint without taking approval of that fee from the committee of creditors. Now, in most of the cases which went before the disciplinary committee had observed that whenever the RP was required to appoint a valuer, they proposed a resolution for appointment of valuer along with the approval of the fees before the committee of creditors. In many cases, the disciplinary committee saw that the COC recommended the registered valuer, or one of the large financial creditors recommended a valuer whom the RP chose to appoint. In many of the cases, we have also seen that when we were appointing forensic auditor, the forensic auditor was appointed with the approval of the committee of creditors. But actually, friends, the law does not envisages any role of the committee of creditors whenever the RP wants to appoint a professional under section 20 or wherever required to perform his duties and obligations under the code. COC does not have any role to play as far as appointment of such professionals is concerned, and that is period. In many of the disciplinary cases which we are going to discuss over here, these things have come out, and the board has very strictly held that an IP is an independent professional. He should not give way of his responsibility to the committee of creditors. Committee of creditors does not have any role in appointment of any professionals. It is purely and purely the domain of the resolution professional. Yes, as far as his fees is concerned, the resolution professional is expected to get it approved, because without the approval, it will not form part of the CIRP cost. Many of the IPs would feel that if I appoint a professional and suppose the COC does not approve his or her fee, right? There could be a situation because the COC may say that, no, you did not ask me. So now we have these judgments which very categorically says that, look, it is not the domain of the COC. I have to appoint the professional based on the guidance provided in the law. Yeah, as far as fees is concerned, what best as an insolvency professional I could do is that while appointing a professional, I can take quotation from at least 3 to 4 people or maybe more than that, and whoever provides the L1 quotation and also suits to the requirement of the job may be considered to be appointed. So what we can do is that we can document the reasons and the choice of the professionals, and also basically, since we have to take approval of the fees from the committee of creditors, it is also very important that that L1 criteria should be very well documented and recorded so that the COC also feels comfortable. So whenever we are challenged by the COC that no, the appointment should have been with prior consent of the committee of creditors, these are the judgments we can definitely quote. So in this particular case, friends, one of the valuers was engaged by the resolution professional and was based on the recommendation of one of the financial creditor. Here, friend, the RP has gotten an extra mile beyond the law, because it is not only he has not acted on the recommendation of the committee of creditors, he has rather acted on the recommendation of one of the financial creditors. And when the board asked him that why did you do that, and there is a contravention, he contended that the court does not impose any embargo on such a point, right? So he wanted to say that nowhere in the code it is provided that you cannot take a recommendation from any of the financial creditor for appointment of a professional. Now look at what the board has to say. Board very clearly mentioned, just a moment. Yeah. So no embargo does not entitle an IP to do anything that is not explicitly prohibited. There is always an embargo on doing something inappropriate, more so by an insolvency professional. He has duty to preserve and protect the value of the assets of the CD and to maintain complete independence of the professional relationship. How will one maximize the value of the assets of the corporate debtor, which is the solemn objective of the code, unless one has an objective and credible value of the underlying assets? This requires utmost professional independence. COC did not exist in this matter when the IRP was required to appoint valuers. How did he get a recommendation from a member of the COC unless there is some private understanding between the IRP and the person who is likely to be a member of the COC? So friends, just look at the perception which the disciplinary committee formed out of this appointment. The disciplinary committee feels that if the RP got into a private conversation with one of the financial creditor for the appointment of the valuer, he has not only compromised his professional independence, but then there also appears to be some private understanding between the IRP and the financial creditor, so that a person who is likely to be a member, so that a person who is being appointed as a valuer is a person who is known to the financial creditor, right? So this was held to be in violation, and the rest you can definitely read it on your own. Time is short, so I will also rush. IP handed over the custody of assets to the suspended directors with approval of COC. Very interesting case, friends. In this particular matter, the insolvency professional, what he did was that he gave the custody of all the assets to the director of the corporate debtors, stating that he does not have any other office space available, so that he can bring in those assets, keep in the custody, so it would tantamount to unnecessary burden of cost, etc. So let me allow the suspended director to continue holding the assets. So board was very uh, board was not happy with the conduct, and they said that no, it is a contravention of the code of conduct. And as far as approval of COC, he mentioned that no, he has handed over the custody of assets to the suspended directors with approval of COC. So board, in its finding, came to know that what the IP did was that he handed over the custody of those assets, and then in the subsequent committee of creditors meeting, he just informed the financial creditors that no, what he has done. But then the board also went to say that even if it was with the approval of the committee of creditors, the committee of creditors does not have any role to play as far as custody of assets is concerned. The role of the COC is different. The role of the IP is different. The COC cannot mandate an IP to act beyond what is provided in the law. And the law very clearly provides that the assets would be in the custody of the IP, and he has to also act. He also has to act as the board of directors of the company, and hence it was held to be in contravention of the law and the code of conduct. The next case is IP failed to appoint independent forensic auditor and failed to file application for irregular transactions during CIRP. This is a matter which I would definitely like you to have a look at. Here, the forensic auditor was one of the person was appointed as a forensic auditor by the financial creditor. Now, when the RP came on board, he appointed the same person to conduct the forensic auditor of irregular transactions. What he did was that he basically extended the scope of the work which was given to that particular auditor earlier by the financial creditor, right? So what I want to reiterate over here is that in a matter concerning a particular CD, the financial creditor had already appointed a firm as the forensic auditor with a different scope. Now, when the RP came in and CIRP began, what that RP did was that he continued with the same auditor based on the recommendation of that financial creditor and just extended the scope of the audit to also include the irregular transactions, right? And plus, thereafter, RP did not file suitable application for the same beyond the adjudicating authority. And the reasons what he gave was that the COC wanted to get some reply from the suspended director as far as the irregular transactions were concerned, because there were several irregular transactions noticed in that particular matter. So COC and the RP gave opportunity to the suspended directors to basically give their clarification on the findings. And in order to get those findings, 3 committee of creditors meeting were already held. And thereafter, the RP resigned from the committee, from the CIRP process, and hence he contended that by the time the COC wanted him to file the application, he had already put in his resignation, and hence he did not file and he was not required to file the regular transaction application. Now, the DC has viewed it very seriously, and they very clearly stated again, like the earlier case, that COC and IP does not have similar role in the court. A forensic audit has to be conducted by the insolvency professional whenever he feels that there are certain irregular transactions, or if he wants to identify certain irregular transactions. So it is basically his baby to appoint a forensic auditor. If he has appointed a forensic auditor who was already engaged by a financial creditor of that particular COC, he has compromised on the independence, because the RP mentioned that there would be additional cost, etc., and time which would be required if he appoints another auditor. So the disciplinary committee was of a very clear view that it doesn't matter, additional cost would have been imposed, but hiring a person who was already working on the interest of one particular creditor could not have basically taken into the interest of all the other stakeholders. Now, here the question also arises that, whenever you are appointing an auditor, he is basically an independent auditor, because the Institute of Chartered Accountants guideline and the other relevant guidelines also very clearly mentions that auditor has to be independent in his duty. But then let me tell you, the disciplinary committee is very clear in its view that whenever such contentions are being put forward by any of the persons who have contravened the law, the board very clearly says that, look, IBC has section 238, which overrides the provisions of any other law. Though the auditor is independent, but then if the objective of the law is to appoint an independent auditor, it means that he should be independent of all the other stakeholders. And whenever we are appointing one particular auditor who is already employed by one of the stakeholder who is a financial creditor, he cannot be said to be doing justice in his role, because ultimately irregular transaction report would basically cater to the interest of all the other stakeholders of the CRP process. And hence, the board felt that no, RP should not have appointed the same forensic auditor as was appointed by the financial creditor. It doesn't matter if there was cost and time. Why is the RP talking about time? It is quite perplexing to that saving time at this stage was important for RP, but he did not even choose to file the irregular transaction application in spite of having been aware of the irregular transactions for a period of 3 months. So while one can appreciate that the views of the COC and CD are considered before filing the application for irregular transaction, it is difficult to appreciate that the COC would debate, consider, and decide the matter in its several meetings for many months, while RP is a silent spectator. The court puts the RP on the driver's seat as far as irregular transactions are concerned and does not envisage any role of the COC on the matter. So hence, the RP was held to be contravening many of the provisions of the law, and you can go through this order in detail because this is very relevant for all the IPs. So then one of the matter is IP failed to act on the directions issued by IBBI. Then the other matter is IP failed to act on the order of NCLAT and suppressed it before adjudicating authority. So friends, it is very, very important that any directions which is given by the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India is under a particular regulation, that is regulation 196. And if a board gives a direction, so in this particular case, just let me take you through very, very important and very interesting. IBBI noticed that in the UI which the RP has brought out, there were certain fallacies. So Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India wrote to the resolution professional that you please issue a fresh UI because it contains certain deficiencies and it is not as per the format and not as per what is provided in the code. So what RP did was that RP took a legal opinion, and as per the legal opinion, the said UI was found to be in order, and he placed that legal opinion before the COC. And he also mentioned that IBBI has also issued directions to change it. But since there is a legal notice, so I'm placing the legal notice. And as per the as per the legal opinion, the UI is fine as per law. And what he did was that he just mentioned about the IBBI direction. He did not place the letter which he received from IBBI before the COC. So the COC said that okay, it's fine. When there is a legal opinion, then you do not change the UI, let this UI continue. So DC came on heavily on the RP upon the findings, and they said that who is COC to ignore the directions of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India? COC does not have any power in the code because we have issued directions to the RP under a specific section of the code, which does not come in the way between what board is directing to the IP. COC has a different role and COC cannot come in between. The board also said that had you also placed the directions of the board before the COC, apart from the legal opinion, probably COC would not have allowed you to continue with the same UI. So you have not also deprived the COC of the facts, but rather you have conducted yourself with an intent which is not acceptable, because you have not brought the entire facts before the COC, and hence you have violated the directions of the IBBI, so you are guilty. similarly, in one of the matter, friends, it would be interesting to note that there was an order of NCLAT, and in the order of NCLAT, there was particular directions given to the IP, and the IP was directed that you place all these matters before the National Company Law Tribunal of your relevant jurisdiction by basically presenting the entire matter before the adjudicating authority over there. So what IP did was that IP suppressed the NCLAT order, and he went on making his own presentation or brief before the adjudicating authority without any regard to the NCLAT order. The matter then finally came to NCLAT, and NCLAT observed this fact, and NCLAT wrote to the IP through a directive that why not contempt of court proceedings be initiated against the insolvency professional. And this matter was also flagged to the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India. Later on, the IP pleaded, sorry before the NCLAT and pleaded that in future such kind of mistakes will never happen. So the NCLAT withdrew the contempt proceedings. Now, friends, the DC took a view that the NCLAT might have discontinued with the contempt proceedings based on the pleadings by the insolvency professional. That is fine. But that does not absolve you from the misconduct which you have performed by not adhering to the orders of the adjudicating authority. And hence, it is a clear violation of the code of conduct. If you do not honor the orders of the adjudicating authority, it is highly likely that you are unbecoming yourself as an insolvency professional. That is not what is expected from you. You are expected to set very high standards, provide confidence to all the stakeholders. If you come forward and disobey the orders of the adjudicating authority and try to suppress the facts before the adjudicating authority, it is absolutely not acceptable. And hence, he was held to be contravening. And friends, just imagine that his contention that NCLAT has absolved him from the contempt proceeding did not go well, was not acceptable as far as disciplinary committee proceedings is concerned. The DC committee still held him violative of the code of conduct. The next is IP instructed and allowed payment of his fees during the CIRP to his LLP firm. Another very interesting case, friends. In this particular matter, the insolvency professional was appointed, and basically he was partner of a firm. And as per his arrangement with the applicant, the employees of the firm were required to assist him in all the proceedings of the CIRP. Now, when and also the firm in which he was acting as a partner, the LLP firm in which he was acting as a partner, also had entered into an agreement with all the partners, stating that the partners will not earn fee directly in their own account. Rather, whatever mandate which the partner will handle, the fee will get credited to the account of the firm. Right? So this was an agreement, and this agreement was found to be valid in accordance with the LLP Act also. Right? If you read the judgment, you will come to know the details. Now, friends, subsequently, when the fee was being paid to the RP instructed the corporate debtor that let the fee be paid directly to the firm and not to his own account. And it may also be treated as insolvency resolution process costs. Now, friends, the DC observed the entire matter and investigated the matter, and the DC was of the opinion that RP has contravened the provisions of the code, and rather he has compromised his independence by working as by performing his duties as an insolvency professional, not as an independent professional, but as an employee of the firm, Just imagine, the fees was being paid to the firm. So he has acted as an employee of the firm while performing his duty as a resolution professional, whereas the code very clearly says, section 513, the definition in section 3, that who would be an insolvency professional. Insolvency professional would be a person who would be an independent person who is registered with the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India, and also registered with the Insolvency Professional Agency. And nowhere in the code provides that an LLP or a firm could act as an insolvency professional, and hence it is a violation. The CIRP cost also very clearly says that it includes the fees paid to the insolvency professional. It does not, and firms appoint and professional appointed by the insolvency professional. But as far as his fees getting directed to a firm is not insolvency resolution process cost, and hence the RP was said to be contravening. Friends, here also the DC invoked section 238 because the RP said that no, I followed the guidelines which is provided in the LLP Act. I have already entered into an agreement with the firm, and the firm very clearly mandates all the partners not to take fees in their own name, but all the fees would go to the firm directly. So the DC was of the view that this is a special law. Section 238 overrides any provision which is inconsistent with the provisions of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and hence IBC will prevail, and therefore there is a clear-cut violation. So IP's fees has to go through him only. It cannot go to any other firm, even if the IP wants or instructs. It would tantamount to breach, and it would also tantamount to compromising his independence. And very importantly, the major point which was brought out by the DC was that in this case, by doing so, RP has not conducted himself personally. He has rather acted in this capacity as an employee of the firm, and hence this is not acceptable. IP connived with financial creditor to bail out promoter through OTS during CIRP. Another very interesting case. Friends, here I would take you through the brief facts. The CIRP commenced and admission order was received after CIRP commenced in late August, and CIRP admission order was received on the first week of September, that is after 10 days. There were various contraventions in timelines prescribed for the specific task. The RP submitted that the tasks were completed mostly within the prescribed time, considering the date of receipt of the order by him as the date of commencement of the CIRP. So, friends, now it is a settled law, and we have seen various orders from NCLAT that your timelines will begin from the day when you become aware of the order. When the order comes to your hand or comes to your notice, then your timelines will continue. But then, friends, if you read the order of the disciplinary committee, the disciplinary committee still says that there is a contravention of the law. But yes, there was no way that the RP could have begun his task. So I wanted to highlight on this point because, friends, just imagine that even when there was a situation where the RP could not have acted because the orders were not communicated to him, he was not aware that whether he has been appointed or not, he was not aware that the CIRP has been admitted against the company. He could have only become aware when the CIRP, the admission order came to his hand. Still, the DC feels that there is a violation, but yes, we are not, we are taking a view that RP could not have done anything, and hence we are treating this aside, right? So this is very important for us to note. The RP mentioned that there was slight delay in making public announcement because the CD expressed its inability to make payment for public announcement due to financial constraints. Again, very important. The view of the disciplinary committee over here was that whenever the RP assumes charge, he assumes the role of the board of directors. Why is he relying on the CD who is saying that no, I am not able to pay you, make you any payment for the public announcement due to financial constraints? No, not at all. I mean, you should have moved to the court. Why would you just listen to the CD? You could have brought this to your to the notice of the adjudicating authority if there was any non-cooperation. And how could you just listen to the CD that there was no funds? Did you look into the bank accounts? Did you try to find out that there are any funds or not? How can you just blankly listen to the CD and accept what they're trying to say? Because after admission, you are in control. The CD is suspended, right? The writers of the CD is suspended. Now, again, RP circulated the expression of interest via email to the committee of creditors, comprising of only one financial creditor who approved the draft EOI through email. Thereafter, it was published. RP claimed that it was subsequently ratified in the meeting of the COC, which the disciplinary committee found to be incorrect. Dear friends, often we find that when we are short of time, we may be you know influenced, or we may think that in order to save time, let us take approval from the largest lender. So in this particular case, there were only two members of the committee of creditors. One of the committee of creditors, one of the financial creditor was holding 85% voting share, other was holding 15% voting share. So what RP did was that RP circulated, instead of calling the meeting of COC, RP circulated the draft UI to the committee of creditors without evaluation metrics. And one of the financial creditors who was having 85% voting shares approved it. So RP took it as approved and published the EY. Whereas the provisions of the law very clearly says that EY has to be approved by the COC. So the contention of the RP that the largest financial creditor holding 85% has approved it. So it means that the COC has approved it. The DC totally rejected that claim. The DC is of the view that COC is an institution. Financial creditor is only just one financial creditor. It doesn't matter that one financial creditor is holding 1%, 2%, 3%, 5%, or 85%. We don't care. If anything has to be approved through COC, it has to be placed before the meeting. It doesn't matter that 85% voting share financial creditors has already approved it. Did you place it before the COC? No, it was not required. Then how come you have held so many COCs prior to this particular stage to take approvals for various other matters in the law? You should have held a COC. Taking an approval from one financial creditor does not hold to be correct as per law, and hence you have violated the provisions of section 2.5. And also UI has to be first approved along with the evaluation metrics in the COC and then published. A post facto approval, many times post step, if people feel that due to shortage of time, if we are taking a approval through email, that may not be acceptable as far as IBBI is concerned. It has to be placed before the COC, because all the other COCs, COC meeting, one is not holding over email. So just one meeting over email is not acceptable. It has to be through that proper institution, proper channel, and it has to be approved in the COC and then published. You cannot just publish and then subsequently take an approval of the COC. That is not permitted in law. The RP permitted a recovery plan or OTS to be considered as a resolution plan. Friends, very, very interesting case. After 5 to 6 months of the CRP process, you'll find that RP permitted the promoter to deposit a OTS plan. And what RP did was that he engaged into a private meeting with one of the financial creditors who was holding 85% shares and the promoter to ensure that the OTS plan was approved. Once he got the idea that, okay, financial creditor is approving the OTS plan during the CRP, mind you, what he did was that he called the meeting of the committee of creditors and placed that OTS plan before the committee of creditors without doing any section 29A due diligence, because as per him, the section 29A due diligence was not applicable. He also questioned that when Supreme Court can invoke Article 142 and permit OTS during the CRP process, why can't an RP do it? So just imagine, he's stepping into the shoes and territory of a Supreme Court and taking actions. So all these things were totally not acceptable by the disciplinary committee, and they were very, very dissatisfied with the performance. And it was also noted that in this particular case that the RP sought extension of time before the adjudicating authority, not for invitation of resolution plan, but the reason which he gave was that there is a likely OTS which is undergoing between the the promoter and one of the financial creditor, and hence we need extension of time. This particular OTS would be placed as a resolution plan before the meeting of the committee of creditors, and then it would get approved. In this case, friends, adjudicating authority also approved that OTS as a resolution plan, right? But that excuse or that premise was not acceptable by the DC, because adjudicating authority or Supreme Court, they have got certain inherent powers, and they might have taken certain decision in the interest of the overall scenario. But here, IP conniving with one of the financial creditor, not inviting any resolution plan, not coming out of EOI by taking approval of the COC, has totally disregarded the provisions of the court. And hence there was some bona fide intent and some connivance which was thought, because he was basically promoting the OTS plan of the promoter, wherein that promoter was totally barred under Section 29A. He did not do under any due diligence under Section 29A, because on one hand he said that OTS is a resolution plan, and on one hand he also mentioned that 29A is not applicable as far as OTS is concerned. So friends, totally utterly disregarded the provisions of the court, and hence he was said to be violating the provisions of the law. Then again, discharging your duties as per CRP, as per timelines, friends, I've already given you a sense that even in case of an order which is received by you after 10 days of starting of the CRP process, and you publish the public announcement after 3 days of receiving the order, the DC is still of the view that that is in violation of the law. But yes, there were certain there were certain matters wherein you are not able to act. It is not possible for you to act. So though it is a contravention, but okay, fine. Since you have not been able to act, we are accepting that, okay, we'll take a lenient view and will not take any action in this. So just imagine in such a situation, if there is a contravention, so the slightest of the contravention which you make as far as CRP timelines, etc. is concerned, the DC is of the view that it is a violation, and hence they may slap some penalty under the provisions of the code. Next is that appointment of relative as IRP. Again, that is not at all acceptable. Here, in this particular matter, you will see that IRP was appointed for one of the corporate debtor, and there were certain dues to that particular corporate debtor from 15 other companies. So this particular IRP, what he did was that he wanted to initiate insolvency proceedings against those other 15 companies who were debtor to this corporate debtor in which he was acting as IRP. Now, for making an application, he wanted to propose the name of an RP because that is the mandate of the law. So you know what he did? He appointed his spouse. He nominated his spouse to act as the insolvency professional of those other 15 entities against which he wanted to initiate IRP proceedings. Now, his spouse did not have any experience, did not have any, had not handled a single assignment till date. When the board questioned him, then why did you appoint a relative? So his reply was that none of the other insolvency professionals, mind you, there were 2,000 plus insolvency professionals at that point of time. His response was that none of the other insolvency resolution professionals were willing to accept this assignment without any upfront fee. They were also not willing to fund the cost of the public announcement. They also asked that you have to first make us the give us the money for the making the public announcement. You have to give us some upfront fee. So his spouse was not. His spouse was willing to take the assignment without any upfront fee, without having required the IRP to give her the cost of the public announcement and other expenses which are initially required to be made during the CRP process. And so, in order to save the cost, and since other IPs were not willing to accept the assignment, he appointed his spouse as the IRP in all those 15 men. Let me tell you, friends, board came very heavily on this particular conduct, and they said that the IRP is not appointed based on his ability to fund the CIRP process. It is based on his ability and skill, which is provided, which the code, which the law expects from him, because he has passed an examination, and that is why, after seeing his credentials, skill, and experience, the board has registered him or her. So it is not the funding ability, but the skill of the IRP. Hence, your contention is totally not acceptable. Further, you have violated, completely disregarded the provisions of the code of conduct and also the law by appointing your spouse in 15 matters. 15 matters when your spouse does not have any experience. And there are 2,000 IPs whom you thought that they are not fit, whom you thought that they would be asking money, whom you thought that they need to fund the process. And that is simply not acceptable. There are other matters also which has been very clearly dealt in this particular order. I'm sure that you would love to read and get educated. And matter number 11 is IP while discharging, initiating CIP against other, and yeah, that we have done. IP contracted with the applicant for his appointment as RP and fees thereof. Very, very important, friends. This matter needs to be discussed, because here what happened was that we all know that somebody who initiates insolvency resolution process is technically known as an applicant, and he appoints the IRP, and then he contracts the fees to be paid to the IRP only during the term in which he serves as the interim resolution professional. As insolvency professional, we are all aware that when that interim resolution professional or somebody else gets appointed in his place as a resolution professional, the appointment and the terms are fixed by the committee of creditors. Here, what this particular IRP did was that he contracted with the applicant itself the terms of him acting as the RP after the IRP period is over. Now, the observation and findings of the DC, and he disclosed it to the adjudicating authority, and he disclosed it in his first progress report. So everything was disclosed by him. But DC felt that transparency is welcome. You might have disclosed all the facts, but it cannot be used to override the explicit statutory provisions. No amount of transparency can justify illegal conduct. The fact remains that IP signed a term sheet which the applicant provided for his appointment as RP and his fees as RP. As an IP, he knows well that a RP is appointed only by the COC. Yet he contracted with the operational creditor, who is not legally competent to appoint the resolution professional, to the effect that he would work as RP and he would work for a professional fee of 20.5 lakhs per month. Hence, an agreement with the applicant establishes collusion, indicating compromise of professional independence. This is an attempt to lock in his appointment as RP before the competent authority, that is COC, is born and denuded the competent authority of its rights to choose an RP of its choice as RP and fix his fees. So basically, what the IRP did was that it is basically the right of the COC. So how can you take away the right of the COC by colluding with the applicant in order for his personal interest and try to lock his appointment as a resolution professional? He might have disclosed everything, but that is not acceptable, and that is totally illegal as per the law. Next is the president. I hope that I am having some time, 15 minutes.
Yeah. I think all the participants are ready to hear maybe a few more the orders.
Okay.
So should we continue? Just write in a chat so that we can continue the session for next 15-20 minutes also. Yeah, I think Sumit, we can continue for next 15-20 minutes.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So.
Low. So can you speak louder?
Oh, more louder. Am I audible?
Yeah,
now?
yeah. No, you are audible, but your audio is low. Just if you speak some louder.
Okay. Is it okay now?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be conscious of being more loud now. Uh,
You can adjust your mobile or your device. We can so that we can see you fully. Only half of your face is visible. Right
but I thought that the document is being
now. No,
shared.
fine enough. Please continue.
Yeah. So again, this charging of high fees has always been an issue, and uh, as insolvency professionals, we are sitting in a very closed discussion. We have often felt that in many of the genuine cases, we have been basically forced to compromise on our reasonable fees. But then before the board, there have been various and numerous cases which has come to the light where the fees quoted by the resolution professional has been mind-boggling. It clearly showed a very huge connivance, and the fees which has been quoted in many cases were not worthy of the efforts which was required for an RP to conduct the resolution process. Probably that is why, because of these 10 or 12 instances which has come before the board, though Mr. Sahu has been very vocal in all his meetings and in all his public address that the fees of the RP has to be decided by the market. So it is a function of the market. But then such issues which came before him, wherein abnormally high fees were charged by RPs, which were basically not reflective of his work. Also, in various cases, it has been noticed that RP has already contracted for a fee, but then while billing for the fee, he has charged a fee beyond what was contracted and agreed. So all these situations, all these cases, when it went to the adjudicating authority, of course, there were a lot of disputes and litigations as far as this matter is concerned. It basically brought into limelight all the downsides of the conduct of the RP as far as this fees is concerned. And I feel that in many of the cases it's also affecting the genuine fees which is being charged by the RPs. So this is quite a situation, but yes, we have to face it. But then let us see that what the code of conduct says as far as fees is concerned. See, just a moment. When RP charged hefty fees for his services and ensured that his related parties got the work without due diligence, the RP contended that there is no provision in the code for deciding the fees of the IP. And this is very important for all of us to know. Also, when the COC has approved the fees, it is not open for the board to pass a value judgment on the same by proceeding against the RP. Now, here is a classic case where RP is charging a very high fee, right? He is charging a fee higher than what he contracted. He got it approved before the committee of creditors. And then when the DC charged him, he said that no, it is not the domain of the DC because he has not done anything wrong. He has charged a fee. It is based on the approval given by the committee of creditors. And then he should not be asked questions. The DC held RP was in violation of the law. The DC also observed that clause 25 of the Code of Conduct for Insolvency Professionals explicitly requires an IP to provide services for remuneration which is charged in a transparent manner, is a reasonable reflection of the work necessarily and properly undertaken, and is not inconsistent of the applicable regulations. Further, absence of law does not entitle an IP to charge any fee as he wishes. I know it is very, very subjective, people may have questions in mind that what is reasonable, what should be transparent, because transparency means approval. COC is the competent authority; they have approved it. There, and COC is an independent authority. When they have approved my fee, it means that whatever I have quoted is reasonable, and it measures the kind of work which is expected from me. So, very subjective issue. But in one of the cases wherein all of you are aware of that matter, wherein 5 crores and 5 crores per month of IRP was charged, and 2.5-3 crores was charged per month as RP fees, in a matter wherein the total claim was very, very less, total debt outstanding was very, very less. The code of the disciplinary committee held that the RP was inviolative, and so many reasons has been provided and so many measurement criteria of reasonableness of the fee has been provided by the disciplinary committee. Disciplinary committee observed in that particular order was that what could be the fees of the CEO of that company, or what would be the fees of the what would be the remuneration which the CD was paying to its MD. That could be reflective of the fee, or the reasonableness of the fee which would have been paid to the resolution professional. Now, the resolution professional would have argued that no, the MD alone was not running the show. So where does the law says? Where does the law stops the resolution professional to appoint other professionals? You hire other professionals, give them the fee. The other measure would be the time and the effort which is required for you to basically conduct the CRP process. So these are some indications as to how one can measure and how one can establish that whatever fee which is quoting is reasonable. But yes, if it is very, very haptive, and if it catches to the eye of the disciplinary committee, or for that matter any other person, when he basically sees the fee, then definitely clause 25 would be invoked by the DC in dealing with such matters. So this is a very sensitive issue, and I think people should read the order to get a clear understanding as to what is the thought process of the disciplinary committee as far as the fees of the RP is concerned. It is a market issue, but then, and there is no law which says that this should be the fee. But again, the DC order very clearly says that absence of law does not mean the RP can charge whatever he feels like, right? So it is with this interest, with this objective, one has to read the order and understand that what is required and how we are required to conduct as far as our fees is concerned. RP included fees of legal counsel of COC in the insolvency resolution process cost. Again, friends, we know that the fees of the legal counsel has to be borne by COC. There have been various orders. The circular of the IBBI on the fees, etc., and expenses now also makes it very clear and clarifies this issue. And hence, whenever the legal counsel fees was paid by this paid from the pockets of the corporate debtor, the DC ordered that it has to be brought back and it has to be repaid to the corporate debtor, because it is a stressful situation, and in a company which is in stress, any professionals appointed by the stakeholders, that fee cannot be paid from the pockets of the committee of corporate debtors. And also the corporate insolvency resolution process cost definition does not define that such would be included in the process costs. Then in one of the cases, RP appointed valuers to, and the mandate included the valuation of the properties of the guarantors on the instruction of the COC. That is what he claimed. But yes, it was later found that COC did not give any instruction, and this was totally violative and contravention of the law, and hence the RP should not have done it. By doing so, he has compromised his independency. And even if there was instruction of COC, COC does not have any power in the law to give any such instruction. The valuers have to be appointed by the resolution professional. It is his role. He has to appoint, he has to evaluate, he has to independently evaluate. Do not take into account any consultation of the COC, except for taking it before the COC for approval of his fees that we have already discussed. Failure of RP to cooperate and provide information to IBBI, of course, it is a violation. Abdication of authority by RP in favor of COC for appointment of professionals, this we have discussed. Now, one important issue which I want to discuss is the continuation of auditor services by liquidator under voluntary liquidation process. This is very, very important, friends. And let me admit to you that it has also opened my eyes and my thought process, and it has brought forward, and this is very recent order. This is an order dated 20th March 2020. And I mean, this brings into light facts wherein we as liquidator should be basically aware of. Now, let me take you to the brief facts because this is relevant, and I think I would like to devote 5 minutes and then we will stop. Regulation 11(2) clearly prohibits, this is the voluntary liquidation process and also the liquidation process, same regulations are there. There it is regulation 7. It clearly prohibits the IP from engaging professional who has served as an auditor to the corporate person at any time during the 5-year preceding the liquidation commencement date. The liquidator appointed the existing auditor of the corporate person for auditing its books of accounts for the purpose of submitting its final report on completion of the liquidation process of the corporate person. He was of the opinion that shareholders has decided to continue with the audit services of the existing auditor. Hence, to use the existing auditors for audit services of the company under liquidation, no new formal engagement was issued by the liquidator. During the course of the hearing in the matter, the liquidator was asked by the DC to produce any resolution passed by the members in this regard, but the liquidator denied of having any such resolution. Further, during examination of the records, it was apparent that liquidator himself requested the auditor concerned to audit the special purpose financial information of corporate person under voluntary liquidation. So friends, in a nutshell, what is happening over here is that a voluntary liquidator was appointed. He was to, during the liquidation process, in order to submit his final report, he has to get the audit done of the financial information, right? So he asked the existing auditor to continue and provide the audit of those financial statements. The board said that no, the regulations are very, very clear that RP will not, the liquidator will not engage any professional who has acted as an auditor during 5 years prior to the liquidation commencement. So here, if you are asking the auditor to continue to provide those special services, you should not have done that. The liquidator said that no, this auditor was already appointed by the members and shareholders, and there are no creditors in this company, and hence it did so. So the board asked for the resolution. Where is the resolution through which the auditor was appointed? So the liquidator could not provide that resolution. Rather, on findings, board said that board found that liquidator has given a letter to to that auditor asking him to conduct the audit, special purpose audit. So board said that no, you have appointed him, and hence you are at fault. So here is a case wherein a special purpose financial audit was mandated by the liquidator to the same auditor who was earlier acting as statutory auditor of the company, and hence it was held to be violation of regulation 11. Now friends, the important question which comes to my mind is that, for example, if I am conducting a liquidation process, and suppose 2 years prior to the liquidation process, and it is a listed company, let us assume 2 years prior to the liquidation process, the shareholders are the people who appoint the auditor, and we know that as per the Companies Act, the auditor has to be appointed for a period of 5 years. The auditor has been appointed for a period of 5 years. And when the liquidation commencement begins, and if I have to sell the the corporate debtor as a going concern, till I exhaust my responsibilities and till I exhaust all my possibilities of selling it as a going concern, I would like to audit the accounts of the company even during the liquidation. Or for that matter, let us assume that the liquidation proceedings started in January. So at least for a major part of the company, for the major part of the year, the company has continued to operate as a going concern. And initially 3-4 periods, I have to take steps to revive the company by finding out options under section 230 of scheme. Then we have to try to sell the corporate debtor as a going concern. By that time, March, April, May would come. So since the majority part of the year the company has operated, the audit will definitely continue. Now, the same auditor who has already appointed will definitely continue to audit the accounts of the company. But here, what I understand from reading the order is that once the liquidation process sets in, the duty of the liquidator under Regulation 11 is to remove the auditor, existing auditor. And whatever he does, he has to appoint fresh auditor. So we would be faced with different scenarios wherein whenever we act as liquidator, there could be situation that we want to run the company, run the business. So we will like to keep some of the employees. There may be certain outsourced contracts, outsourced professionals who are already providing services from a long time basis to the company for its business operations. So they will also continue. It's only that when I'm required to hire professionals for conducting my duties under the code, say for example, auditing the receipts and payments accounts on a quarterly basis, right? Or for appointment of professional advisors, then only I'm required to see that whoever I'm appointing should be independent. They should not be the auditor. But this puts a question mark that whether the board expects the liquidator to remove all the other employees or all the other professionals who were working on an outsourced basis with the company when the company's liquidation process has not started. Because they are already providing their services. For example, income tax consultants, people who provide secretarial services. If there is no company secretary, are we supposed to remove them? Or will somebody who has done secretarial auditor, will the definition of auditor would include secretarial auditor or cost auditor also? So these are the questions which comes up in my mind, and now I throw the house, throw it open before the house to raise questions, and we can discuss and deliberate further. Of course, this document I would share with all of you, and you can keep a copy of it and get educated. But it is very important that all of us go through the code of conduct and understand what is expected out of the conduct of resolution process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sumit ji, for a very nice and wonderful presentation. And I would say the discussion on the orders of IBBI relating to the disciplinary proceedings. Friends, as Sumit ji said, this document, the link to the document, downloading the document has been posted in the chat box. So any of you wanting to see it, you can download by just clicking on the link or copying into your browser and all, then you can definitely download it. Now, can we have some question? You can raise your hand so that I can unmute you in the participant panel. So you can raise your hand through. So, or any question you want to rather ask to our panelists, you can directly post the questions in the chat box itself. Yes, Mr. Om Prakash. Yeah, you are unmuted, Mr. Om Prakash ji. You can speak now. Om Prakash ji, you are unmuted. You can speak now. I think there is some issues in the audio, Mr. Vedagwal. So anyone else, you have any questions with our speaker? Sumit ji, you may also see the chat box, but I don't think there is any question. Mr. Shetty, I think you are having some question. Yes, just hold on. Yes, you are unmuted.
I just want to know from Mr. Sumit Binani, which is the case law regarding that auditor appointed by the liquidator, continuation of the same auditor. I want the case laws.
Sir, the reference of the case law is provided. I don't want to name the liquidator, sir, for obvious reasons.
If you can tell the case, if you can tell me the case, that's enough.
Yeah, it's there. The case number is written over there. Date and case number is already written in the
document. Yeah, in the document, you can download the document and you'll have the details. And definitely you'll get the order.
It's a 20th March, no?
Yes, 20th March.
Okay, thank you.
Naveen is having some question. Let me, Naveen, unmute you. You can ask the question directly. Yes, Naveen, you are unmuted. You can speak.
1 minute. भैया मेरा क्वेश्चन था कि अभी जब ये सब न्यूज में आ रहा है कि सेक्शन 7, 9, 10 का सस्पेंशन होगा 6 महीना के लिए, तो अभी तो ऐसे भी इंसॉल्वेंसी में 1 लाख से 1 करोड़ का वो क्लेम का अमाउंट कर दिया है, तो आने वाले दिन में क्या आईपी का फ्यूचर कैसा है? और
देखिए,
going
ऐसा
forward,
your question is out of place, Naveen. I think we'll have
नहीं
different
नहीं, it
forums.
is related to IP.
No, I understand, but
section 7, 9,
everything
10 का suspension will be there, and I think that that should be the right step forward, because अब तो हम ये सुन रहे हैं कि जो रनिंग इंडस्ट्रीज है वही हाथ खड़ा कर रही है कि एम्प्लॉइज को पैसा नहीं देंगे, तो ये थोड़ा डेफर हो जाए तो अच्छा है, but yes, it will be quite challenging for the ongoing cases how we are going to handle it, because the business, if there are any companies which are running, that will further go down. How we are going to pay the employees salary, wages, etc. is a lot of concern. So very tough times for all the RP. It's good that no new work is coming to, because at least let the matter settle down, because otherwise the courts will also be burdened, because there will be very matters which would be taken to the court after this lockdown. And I think that should be the right step forward. And 1 crore is permanent, because now they've changed the law. The central government notification has come. So it is not that people are thinking that it is for a few months. No, the insolvency committee report also proposed 50 lakhs, but they have made it 1 crore, and this was quite on the cards from quite a long time. So I don't think that it is only because of the corona we have seen, but yes, it has hurriedly come because of corona.
Thank you, Naveen. Sumit ji, I mean, I have one question. I mean, as you said in one of the disciplinary orders, that while publication of the public announcement, it was delayed because the order was not available. You see, in many of the cases, what we have is order has been pronounced, but the order is not uploaded either in the NCLT website, or it has not come to our mail, or rather we have not received the physical copy. So in this scenario, it's very difficult to make a public announcement without having an order, maybe physical or digital. So how do you take this? I mean, if there is a default, I mean, rather if there is a delay in this part, so how do you take it?
You see, it is definitely not a default. But what I wanted to say is that I wanted you to take you through the thought process of the disciplinary committee by citing that though they are recognizing that it was not within the within the control of the RP to come out with a public announcement without getting the order or without being aware of the order. That is fine. But then as per law, there's still a violation. So what I wanted to highlight by saying this is that even in such cases where it was not beyond the control, it was not within the control of the RP to act in accordance with the timelines. There also the DC mentioned that it is a contravention, but yes, we are just absolving you because it was not within your control. So we can just understand the magnanimity of the thought process of the DC, because if there is even a slightest violation, it is not that DC is going to ignore it. That is the point which I wanted to make. So let us be very serious about the code of conduct and the timelines which is required to be.
Right. Mr. Gautam Mittal, you have anything to ask? Mr. Gautam, you have raised your hand.
Yeah, I have one point. I'd like to discuss my position in one of my cases where I had to take the handover. I just talked to the COC member. It's a sole COC member. And I talked to him that I am going to take handover. I'm going to take the handover on so and so date. Now, what COC member advised me that you take the services of the ex-security agency because it is empaneled with us. And the payment will be smooth in that case. And if you hire any security agency that is of your choice, maybe payments will be delayed by 3 or 4 months. Now, how to handle these kind of situations? Just a practical point.
Sir, anything getting recorded, there would be many situations wherein you like to see that the process goes on seamlessly. I can understand what you're trying to say. But then the position of law is very clear that COC does not have any role to play. It is only you. But yes, if it is not recorded, and if you feel that the proposal given by COC, because as professionals, we can hardly evaluate that what is the which security agency is good or bad, unless and until we have, except for few cases, except for few good names. There are few good names that we are aware, but there are
Yeah,
many
that is true.
security
That is
agencies.
true.
Yeah, but there are many other security agencies which are providing service.
Hello. I'm not able to hear you.
They are
Sumit,
not
you are
competent.
not audible. You are
They
not
are
audible.
not competent enough to identify that which security services is better, except for the names which are more popular. So in such
Uh,
cases, without
mhm.
recording, without getting the things recorded, for a practical purpose, we may act as per the wishes of COC. But then if we record it, definitely DC is going to take a serious look.
Yeah, Hema ji, it's nice to see
Yeah,
you. So please, you are muted.
Yes,
yeah,
Hema, welcome. Hema is a very strong lady and she fought the corporate debtor like anything from day one. We have read the
good mo-
orders, Hema. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Sumit. Good morning. It was very nice to hear you and enlighten us on so many topics, which we tend to oversee due to paucity of time. My
Right.
question: when the disciplinary committee issues a show cause notice asking the IPRP to give its side of the story when a case has been a complaint has been filed against them. What is generally the timeline within which the disciplinary committee concludes the matter and reports its findings, or give your chance to give your side of the explanation personally?
As per law, it is 6 months, if I remember correctly.
Yeah,
But it all depends upon the current team strength, etc. So normally it is 3 to 4 months minimum it takes.
right,
But
right.
yes, maximum time by which it has to dispose is 6 months.
Okay. So that is not any mandatory and directory as such in these matters of IPBI.
Pardon? I did not get your question.
The timelines which are mentioned to be, filing of under IB code, whatever timelines are given, just like the courts have made certain mandatory and certain directory. So in case of IBBI, you don't have any such timelines, though it is
No,
mentioned.
6 months is the maximum. Outer timeline is 6 months.
6 months. Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah. Thank you so much.
So, if we do not have any further questions, we can conclude this session. So, any last question? Yes, Mr. Uday Shankar. Just hold on. Yes, you are unmuted. You may ask your question. Mr. Uday, you are unmuted.
Yeah, I'm trying to. Hello.
Yeah, please. Please speak up.
See, I have continuing the services of the security provider, which COC has appointed since last 2-3 years, because the company is under was closed down, and all the assets have been sold by the Surfacey. Now,
Okay.
since the date of CRP process, I have included this services as a part of CRP expenses. But any documentation and all that, what would be the good practice to continue this kind of arrangement?
So this is CRP or liquidation, sir?
This is a CRP, but I have in the last meeting I have made an application for liquidation.
Okay. So see, under CRP there is no issue because the company continues to operate as a going concern, and all the external services provider who are there with the company, if you find them competent enough, you can continue with them.
Yeah.
Even appointed earlier, like the earlier management might have appointed them, or in some cases the financial creditors, because of some stress, might have appointed security agency. So that is fine until unless those people are not related to you. You can definitely continue, and if they are related, you can disclose. You should disclose. So as far as CRP is concerned, it's fine. When the company steps into liquidation, you can again continue with the same service provider. Of course, you have to issue them the fresh mandate because the company is already shut down. And while issuing the fresh mandate, you have to see that Regulation 7, which basically lists down the independence criteria. And I'm sure that they are security service providers, so they are not the auditors or not relative of the IP or not the auditors of the CD. So they can very well be appointed. Should not be an issue.
Yes, friends, with this, we come to end of this session. Let me tell you, this session was very intriguing. And yes, the main purpose of this session was to rather let all the participants know that how IBBI is taking your every or our every error. Maybe it might be unintentional, but how the decisions are coming in your error. It might be intentional, sometime intentional, or sometime maybe connivance of due to various stakeholders. But yes, to take away home, it's very important that we read all the orders. Then it's very important to read all the orders thoroughly so that when whatever the the point of you see the concern has been raised by or flagged by the IBBI, we can keep in mind while we continue our CIP and liquidation process. Yes, as rightly said, that voluntary liquidation, you are not required to appoint the statutory auditor. But yes, there are many questions like in liquidation, whether you can continue with the old auditor. But I would say that you have to uh, you must appoint a new auditor even in the liquidation process. But yes, it's open to further discussion and debate. And friends, please do join us tomorrow also. We'll be having a different session on IBC itself, wherein Anil Goel will be joining us and taking us through how do we conduct CIP proceeding while even during the lockdown period. So it's very important work and the life must go on and so on. The CIP must go on. So what should we do and how do we take the process forward till this lockdown is over? So please do join us through the same link and through the same ID. And yes, due to the advisory of MHA regarding Zoom, if you wish not to join through Zoom, you can definitely join through our Facebook live page. But let me tell you, we are exercising all the security measures which has been advised by the MHA. But yes, the call to join the Zoom is all yours. So, friends, with this, let us thank Sumitji
Thank you.
for consenting and taking so much pain for compiling all this document before you. And now it is very much, easier and at hand. We can analyze all the disciplinary orders. And we should be definitely, I believe, and you all must believe, you all must know that this will be very useful for our further CRP and liquidation proceeding. Thank you, Sumitji, once again.
Thank you.
With this, friends, we would end this meeting for now. So tomorrow, 11, we are join again.
Thank you.